how many things I've read so far about trains hitting weird stuff? Because let me tell you, it's more than you think. So, at this point, I am no longer surprised. You can tell me a train once slammed into the moon, and, well, I would have many questions, but I also wouldn't be particularly shocked, as it seems like there's been a time or a place where a train has hit everything at some point. On the 17th of August, 1982, and the country in question was Argentina. They just got done dealing with the Falklands War, losing it, actually. As for the helicopter in question, it was a Bell UH-1 Iroquois, also known as a Huey, which is what I'm going to call it because I like that name. Hueys are actually an American model helicopter manufactured by Bell Helicopter to meet a 1952 U.S. Army requirement for a medical evacuation and utility helicopter. They first flew in 1956. They are arguably one of the most successful helicopters produced for the United States military that there has ever been, period. They were produced between 1956 and 1987, and they built over 16,000 of the little guys. They are good, solid pieces of equipment, and still in use in some places to this day. And one of the users was the Argentinian Air Force and Army Aviation. Bell UH-1H, Iroquois serial number 9522, register H12, was flying when the pilot noticed that he was suffering an engine failure. Now, some people assume that helicopters are kind of in major trouble when the engine fails. And by major trouble, they think they fall out of the sky, and that's actually not true at all. See, helicopters, kind of like planes, do have a backup in case the engine fails. With planes, as you know, they can glide. So in the event of an engine failure, the pilot can sometimes get the plane to a safe position in order to land it safely. It's still an emergency, but it has been done before. In a helicopter's case, they utilize an effect known as auto-rotation. It's a state of flight in which the main rotor system of a helicopter turns by the action of the air moving up through the rotor, not down like when the engine is actually working. What does this do? Well, basically, it causes the descent of the helicopter to actually be relatively slow. In fact, you may have seen the effect done on tree seeds. Those spinny winged seeds, those helicopters we called them when we were little? Yeah, it's the same kind of effect. Helicopter pilots are trained to handle this sort of situation and allow the aircraft to land safely just by allowing the rotors to rotate freely. They don't just careen out of the sky, as you might think. They can float relatively safely to the ground as long as the pilot stays calm and remains in control. And that was what happened here. The engine failed, and the Huey went into auto-rotation. The pilot was able to bring it down safely, but in the area he was in, he was forced to make an emergency landing, yes, on a railroad track. Why do they keep doing that? Well, just like with the incident in LA, it was probably because it really was the safest spot. If it was over a city, you have the road, which people are on, you have buildings, which people are in, and you have the railroad track, which I'm sure when he brought it down, didn't have a train on it at that moment, so it probably was the best bet he had. But the problem was, there was a train coming. And yes, the Huey was slammed into by a train, though based on the picture, it doesn't appear to have hit it particularly hard. Hueys are sturdy and all, but I doubt they would have taken 80 miles per hour from a train. Based on the fact that the tail appears to have been completely crunched, it was probably doing 30, maybe 40 miles an hour, tops. Not so fast as to do major structural damage to the main body of the helicopter. You may be wondering, what train is it? Okay, look, we've been over this. Some of these, it's pretty hard to figure out exactly what locomotive is involved here, but we do have a picture of it, so I was able to do some digging and figure out what this might be. This is probably a Toshiba EMU, which is an electric train set manufactured by, yes, that Toshiba. The same Toshiba that may have created the device you may be watching this video on right now. They have historically made these electric rail units, and they're actually pretty decent. One of the biggest customers of these EMU units was Argentina, and in fact, many of these were actually manufactured in Argentina. And the Huey was actually repaired and put back into service. Though as of 2010 it was reported that the helicopter is no longer in flyable condition. However, it was suggested in 2013 that it may be converted to a Huey-2, but it could also be used for spare parts, and at this point, that's where the trail seems to end, so it may have already been taken apart. This is, in fact, the only time I've ever heard of a train hitting a helicopter, and frankly, I hope it never happens again. I would like this to stop, but this is a rabbit hole that just keeps going and going and going, like we're off to Wonderland. Or Argentina, as it would be. I'm sure I'll get a comment like, actually, the Russians once slammed a train into a nuclear bomb! Oh, God. Now, the Apollo as a ship and its fate often get overshadowed by its, history that I'm going to attempt to dance around, so give me a moment. Though the incident in question happened at the beginning of the 80s, the ship was actually launched in 1936. Originally, the Apollo wasn't called the Apollo. It was the MV Royal Scotsman, becoming the HMS Royal Scotsman. Yes, this was a Royal Navy ship. Though she was designed as a passenger ferry, when World War II happened, again, the UK did whatever they had to do, so she was converted into a troop carrier, seeing action in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. The Royal Scotsman wasn't the largest ship ever, but it was 3,244 GRT, gross registered tons, and 340 feet long, or 100 meters. She was powered by twin diesel engines and could hold roughly 1,000 people on board, give or take. Now, after the war, she was returned to her original owners, Burns and Laird Lines, and was utilized for her original purpose as a simple ferry until 1967, when she was put up for sale and purchased by the Church of Scientology. Yeah, see, I told you this ship's history gets weird. Now, like I said, this part of the story kinda tends to overshadow what I really actually want to talk about, which is the whole train versus boat thing. So I'm going to sort of rush through the parts involving the Church of Scientology because, let's be real, that isn't what we do here. I try to avoid getting into religion and beliefs and cults and whatever you want to call Scientology. That's your opinion. Feel free to express it in the no man's land that we call the YouTube comment section. I will not question you on this particular subject. I am simply going through the actual history of this boat. And it was sold to the Church of Scientology to be used as the flagship for their Sea Org. Now, Sea Org is, well, a big topic on its own, but let's just say that L. Ron Hubbard was kind of trying to make his own country in the water, like, you know, an organization on the sea, and it didn't really pan out so well when it came to actually being on the open ocean. The Sea Org is technically still around. Again, beast of a topic, not going to touch it. Not what we do here. I talk about trains and planes and actual history, and I don't need to get into that. You know, that. We're gonna dodge that bullet today. But when Sea Org in its original form did not pan out, according to what L. Ron Hubbard wanted to do, and the church went ashore in Florida, the ship, which by that point had been renamed the MV Apollo, kinda wasn't useful at all. The thing about most vehicles is that if they're not being used to, like, move, then they just wind up burning a hole in the owner's pocket. Ships in particular are notorious for this, as unless you own the docks, and they didn't, you have to pay for renting the space for the ship to be docked, you have to pay to keep the ship up to par, you have to pay for the fuel to keep the ship fueled in case you have to move it. There's a whole ton of costs that go into maintaining a ship of this size, and they weren't using it. So it was kind of a waste of money. It would have been for anybody. So in 1977, the Apollo was sold for $90,000 to Consolidated Andy Incorporated, a shipbreaking firm located in Brownsville, Texas. It was expected that the Apollo would be brought to their docks and, well, scrapped. That's what shipbreaking firms do. But interestingly enough, that's not what happened, at least not immediately. Richard Jaros, who was the vice president of Consolidated Andy Inc., apparently took a liking to the Apollo. And I'm not going to question that, it was a nice looking boat, don't get me wrong, but he had the odd idea of turning it into a floating restaurant and relocating it to South Padre Island as kind of a tourist attraction. Now, this never came to fruition. Within a year, Consolidated Andy Incorporated actually resold the Apollo to a company called Zanzibar Shipping for $188,000, which means they flipped it for double their money in a year. So I think they kind of made out pretty well either way. At this point, the Apollo was rechristened the Arctic Star, which I actually kind of like. I like that name. It's a good name. I'll take it. It was under control by Zanzibar. Now, Zanzibar Shipping is kind of a weird, shady corporation. According to court documents, they're a Panamanian corporation, which makes sense. But at that time, even though they said they did no business in the United States, they had headquarters in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. What? You know, I'm not even getting into this. How many times is this one ship gonna go from shady organization to shady organization in this one story? Let's get to the train. The year was 1981, middle of July. It's kind of hazy exactly what date. It's believed this happened on the 19th, but sources aren't consistent on this, so just to be safe, we'll say July 1981. The Arctic Star was actually still docked at Brownsville, Texas, for whatever reason, even though it had changed hands to Zanzibar by that point, and it was quite literally sitting, minding its own business. The Arctic Star hadn't hurt anybody, it hadn't done anything wrong, it was just chilling. And boy, it sure would be a shame if something came along and ruined that. Enter the Missouri Pacific 2199. This particular diesel-electric locomotive was an EMD GP38-2. They were manufactured between 1972 and 1986. Over 2,000 have been produced, and most of them are still in service. But 2199, despite having an otherwise unnotable career, decided that would be a good day to do something unprecedented. And by that I mean, it itself wouldn't actually do anything wrong as far as anybody can tell. I will tell you this locomotive did not strike the Arctic Star. That didn't happen. What did happen was that as 2199 was pulling a train of 18 fully loaded freight cars, 7 of those cars broke away. Sources, again, are not clear why they broke away, though based on the fact that 2199 was moving at the time, I would bet money on a faulty coupler, or perhaps even an overloaded train. Additionally, 2199 was going uphill at the time. So 7 fully loaded freight cars are now running away down a hill. This hill happens to end up at a turn that falls conveniently in line with where the Arctic Star was docked. Now you might be saying, well, there's no way those cars could possibly reach the Arctic Star. I mean, it's on a dock, these are tracks, and true, but many railroads do have lines that are in spitting distance of ship docks. It just makes sense when it comes to loading and offloading goods. There was a concrete barrier in place, specifically to prevent this kind of thing from being as dangerous as it turned out to be, but the freight cars decided to jump the track, crash straight over that, and then plow through the Arctic Star. Not into, through the ship. According to Captain Robert Manning, who I gotta say, definitely owns the role of being a ship's captain, he stepped out of the Arctic Star to find a train hanging out of the side of his ship. The cars had hit so hard that they penetrated the hull of the Arctic Star. Not only that, but they struck the stern. This resulted in the bow of the ship being forced into the dock, doing further damage, and twisting the hull, which, wow, I don't even want to talk about how much it would take to do that. Oh, it's probably worth mentioning that the ship was tethered to the dock with 9-inch polypropylene lines. Now, polypropylene is an extremely prevalent plastic product. It's in just too many things to name. But the reason for that is that it's extremely strong, and the impact snapped 9-inch polypropylene lines. Now, fortunately, nobody was hurt. And like I said, 2199 hadn't actually hit anything, so it just kind of returned to service and pretended like it saw nothing. Zanzibar would take Missouri Pacific to court, and they would wind up having to pay nearly $300,000 in compensation for the destruction of the Arctic Star. And yes, the Arctic Star was not rebuilt. Its hull was bent. There was just no profit into fixing it at that point. So she was sent to another shipbreaking yard where she was finally broken up into pieces and sold for scrap. 2199 is now with Union Pacific since they merged with Missouri Pacific in 1996, and as far as anyone's able to tell, she's still in service, so, you know, that worked out. I don't think that diesel has done anything nearly this crazy since then, and I kinda hope it doesn't, because I hope this is the only time I ever have to talk about a train running away and slamming into a boat, because what stars aligned to cause this ridiculous accident? It's just fortunate nobody was hurt, and the only loss was a ship whose history was a lot more colorful than anyone would have expected. Before we even begin, what in the blue heck is a Soziobahn? Also, how do I say that word so easily? And I looked up the pronunciation before I even did the video because I knew I'd be saying it a lot. It's one of those things where I'm like, no, I'm going to be saying that way too much. I need to know exactly how to say that word. And the Swedish pronunciation is Soziobahn. So that's what I'm going to stick with, because it's your language, I'm going to respect that. Soziobahn is actually a locality in Sweden, and Soziobahn literally means the salt sea baths. But the railway is named after that locality, that historically speaking, as much as I've been able to gather, has been not only relatively unchanged over the last century, but is enjoyed and quite useful for the locals that live over there. Feel free to correct me if you're from Sweden and maybe it's horrible. I don't know, but it sounds pretty good from what I've been able to read. It's also probably worth mentioning before we begin that the Soltiobaden Railway is currently operated by the British Arriva Company. And their name's gonna come up a few times during this story too, because they're not completely innocent when it comes to how this all played out. That being said, how did one of their trains hit an apartment building? I mean, it's a local rail network. Lower speeds. It shouldn't have jumped the track under normal circumstances, and you're right. Now, the rolling stock in question for this accident are actually electric rail cars that are collectively known as the C-Series, or C-Trains. Soltiobaden's version is actually based off of the ones used by the Stockholm Metro system, but they were converted from using a third rail electricity pickup to pantograph lines instead. They're alright for the most part as far as subway-type trains goes. They're usually set up with a minimum of 2 cars. The C10s are the motorized cars, and those usually lead, and they're always permanently coupled to a C11, which is unmotorized. They're often set up in trains of 4, 2 powered, 2 unpowered. And for a regional service like this is a totally acceptable train setup. People that use this aren't going that far, so you don't necessarily need lengthy travel comfort design. Nah, you just need the 50% standing, 50% seated kind of subway setup. That's totally okay. They're also decently fast for what they are, able to travel up to 43 miles per hour, or 70 kilometers per hour. But I'm sure you're saying, well, that's all well and good, but how did one slam into an apartment building? Okay, fair question. Don't yell at me. The incident happened on the 15th of January 2013. At around 2 a.m., there was a cleaner working on one of the trains parked at the depot. This wasn't unusual, and in fact, Arriva had contracted a third-party company to come in and clean the trains for them. Again, not something that's unheard of, but what is unheard of is the cleaner being on board a train as it decided to go off on its own. At 2:22 a.m., just as the cleaning lady was about to leave the train, the locomotive started up and quickly made its way out of the depot. It reached its maximum speed alarmingly fast, and the cleaning lady had no idea how to even begin to stop it. To make matters worse, it reached a downhill track, which allowed it to exceed its technical top speed, reaching about 50 miles per hour or 80 kilometers per hour. Eventually, it hit a buffer, and the buffer was only designed to stop a train that was traveling up to 25 miles per hour, which this train was doing double that, so that wasn't going to work. And the 90-ton train plowed over the buffer, slid over some bushes and a footpath, missed a ramp into a basement garage, and then slammed into the side of a 3-story apartment building. No one was killed during this, fortunately. The residents inside the building were not in the way of the train when it went through the wall. The cleaning lady, on the other hand, did suffer some serious injuries, and it took some time for rescuers to secure the building so it wouldn't collapse, and pry open the destroyed train to reach the poor woman stuck inside. Now here's where things get a little nutso. As if that wasn't crazy enough, but the rumor circulated, many news reports straight up said this, that the cleaning lady stole the train, turning the power on purpose and causing the crash herself. And in fact, a ton of articles that I read while doing research for this very video specifically say that she stole it, but they don't know why she did that just yet. We'll report on it later, and they never did a follow-up as far as I'm able to tell. So many clickbaity nonsense articles did this, and this is why it's always important, before you report on anything, to have all the facts. I would think that'd be journalism 101, and yet none of those articles seem to have done this, because no, she didn't steal the train. And the most detailed article I found, after doing some digging mind you, finally explained all this, and went into detail about the post-investigation, explaining why exactly the train ran away, and no, it was not because the cleaning lady stole it, no matter how many times these ridiculous corporate news media nonsense-packed journalists want to keep saying it. That's not what happened. The authorities did initially suspect she might have stolen it, but they didn't have any direct evidence, and she didn't have much of a memory of the previous night's events. While she was technically arrested while in the hospital, the charges against her were dropped after only a few days because the authorities realized that no, she didn't steal the train. So what did happen? Why did the locomotive start? Why did it careen to its top speed and then exceed that going downhill? Why was there no positive train control or anything like that? What was going on? Well, that's because the railway employees, working under the watch of Arriva, were not adhering to standard protocols of the railway. The first problem is that, yes, these locomotives were equipped with a dead man switch. Rail fans were probably already asking that question themselves. For those unaware, a dead man switch is a pedal or sometimes a button that has to be pressed while a locomotive is in operation. If it's not, an alarm sounds, and if it isn't pressed back down again, the train is automatically stopped. As the name implies, they were put into place, in case the engineer or driver, dies on his watch. But to be honest, it usually mostly gets used for people just falling asleep, which happens a lot too. The point is, the train shouldn't have even been able to start at all if the deadman switch wasn't pressed down, except that it was disabled. How was it disabled? Well, easily. They probably just threw something heavy on it. By doing this, the train's control system would therefore believe that someone was at the controls when they weren't. Furthermore, the train had been parked with its brakes not on. The brakes were released. This, again, isn't normal. A shunting worker had apparently chosen to do this because the depot's system meant to keep the brakes from freezing into place on the parked tracks was out of order at that part of the depot. This issue had been known about for a month, but Arriva and the Regional Traffic Ministry hadn't actually agreed on who had to pay for that, so it was still broken. If all that wasn't bad enough, the train had been shut off with the power lever in the full forward position, meaning that the second the train was on, it would be at full throttle, with no brakes. And the keys were in it, because the driver just left them there, which is also a violation of protocol. Oh, yeah, so you're probably wondering, well, why in the world was the train even standing still at all? Well, that's because of a safety feature that makes it so that the train actually can't go anywhere if the doors are open. This is, of course, to make sure passengers aren't, dragged at all if the train decides to start while the doors were still open. But in this case, it was the only thing keeping the train from going anywhere. So what actually happened is that as the cleaner finished her job, she closed the doors to the passenger compartment, intending to leave the train through the driver's cab door. When she did this, the train system registered that they were ready to depart, and had a driver present because the deadman switch was held down, and because it was at full throttle, it went straight forward. But I bet you're wondering, well, how did it get on the main line? Because that's where the accident happened. Well, that's because the signal box workers had already set the points for the first train of the day before they went home for the night. This is also yet another violation of the company's protocols. Because if the points hadn't been set, the train could never have gotten up to that kind of speed or run away at all. And yet, that's exactly what it did. It's assumed the woman simply panicked and didn't think things through. There were emergency brake levers, and she might have been able to figure out the controls. It's not a hard locomotive to operate, but again, she was a 20-year-old girl, a cleaning lady. She was just there to do a job. I mean, she could have been freaked out. It's completely understandable that the panic may not have allowed her to think things through and stop the train. Plus, the accident happened rather quickly. Less than 2 minutes after departing the depot, the train crashed. So it wasn't like she had a lot of time to process things. When all this was found out, Arriva changed their protocols and procedures to avoid a repetition of the accident, which is kind of amusing because, technically speaking, they did have the procedures in place, they just weren't being followed at all. So, I guess they made everything stricter? I don't know. Sotyaban was also criticized for not having a train control system, which would have also prevented this, but they would ignore such criticism until 2019 when they finally installed automatic train control, which is a safety feature that I think all railways should have. It really does prevent accidents like this from occurring. Arriva also had to pay 500,000 Swedish krona, which is about 53,000 euros or 62,000 US dollars, for professional negligence causing bodily injury, and they also had to pay a further 20,000 krona, 1,950 euros or 2,300 US dollars, in damage paid to the cleaning lady herself for initially accusing her of stealing the train. And to be honest, I think she should have been given more than that because, like I said, a lot of articles on the internet still say she stole it without giving any additional information like I just did. She didn't steal the train. It was a bunch of different procedures and policies not being followed by the staff that allowed it, and she was just unfortunate enough to be on board. The only thing she did was shut those doors. And how was anyone gonna know, especially the outsourced cleaning lady, that shutting the doors was gonna make the train go up to full speed and crash through a buffer? Okay, no one would have thought about that. No one would have even remotely considered that, let alone her. So it's definitely on the company in this case. As for the apartment, well, it stayed standing, fortunately, and it was later repaired. And as far as the train that crashed into it, well, the rear unit was actually alright. It was given minor repairs and returned to service. However, the leading unit, the powered and the unpowered cars that hit dead on, were considered damaged beyond repair and scrapped. The buffer was also redesigned, making it a lot more sturdy, so if something like that does occur again, it's less likely the train will go completely over them and into a building. I trust you have questions. That's okay. Many times I make these videos and I have questions, even while I'm recording them. It's just one of those things. So, the incident happened on the 2nd of November in 2020. So this was fairly recent, and it involved a train at Diaker Station in, Spijkensnes? It involved that. I'm done. I'm out. I got nothing. Netherlands, you got me. You win. You've won this round. But that place is on the outskirts of Rotterdam, in Holland, in the Netherlands, and yeah, I can't pronounce that word. I'm out. It's fine. It's fine. And the train in question belonged to RET, which stands for Rotterdamse Elektrische Tram, or in English, Rotterdam Electric Tram. Which I could have just said to begin with, but it was way funnier for me to try to say it, because everyone kind of gets amused whenever I, in my American dialect, try to speak words that I have no business saying, but it's fine. But they are the main public transport operator in Rotterdam, Netherlands. They have a few different lines of public transit under their watch, buses and trams, as well as metros. A metro is, well, in America we'd probably call them a subway, but same thing really. Electric railcar units for short-distance commuter service. I had to do some digging to figure out exactly which rail cars we're dealing with today, because none of the news articles told me anything helpful with that, because of course they didn't. They never do, even though there were like 80 articles. Not a single one that I found actually said what rail cars they are, but I believe these are R-Types, Series 5500, I want to say, that were manufactured by Bombardier Transportation, who have come up before. They've made a bunch of different kinds of rolling stock. Some good, some bad. They're kind of hit or miss, I've found, with them. But the R-Types appear to be fine, like absolutely fine. And I only say that based off of how little I was able to find out about them. Given there's not any lengthy articles complaining about them, they're probably fine. They're subway cars, metro cars. But on that day, again, the 2nd of November 2020, at about 12:30 a.m., they would have done their job, except for the fact that one of the units entered Diaker Station way too fast, slammed through the end buffers, and found its way sitting perilously atop a whale statue. Specifically a statue of a whale's tail. This kind of thing doesn't happen to normal people. Now fortunately, the only person that was on board the train at the time was, in fact, just the driver. And he was a bit shaken up, for obvious reasons, and he was taken to the hospital, but found to be uninjured, just suffering from mild shock from the whole ordeal. The statues are, well, whale tail sculptures. That's literally what they're called. The sculptures had been there a while, created 20 years prior by Martin Strutz? Yes? No? Possibly. I don't know, I gave it a shot. And it was the only reason why the train didn't fall 30 feet into the water below, because the Diaker Station is elevated, as you've probably noticed by now. The artist was actually interviewed about the incident and said he was incredibly shocked that the sculpture was able to hold the train at all, because it was not made of material that was meant to hold this kind of weight, like, at all. This is a multi-ton train unit we're talking about here. The whale sculpture is meant to support its own weight, nothing more. So why didn't it collapse? Well, there's a couple reasons for it. For one, the train isn't completely on the whale sculpture. As you can see in the pictures, the rear portion is still on the main platform, so its full weight isn't completely on the whale statue. Additionally, like I said, the only person on board was the driver. Had there been passengers on board, this may have been different, because passengers add quite a bit of weight to any train. I mean, if you think about it, let's ballpark it and say the average weight of all the passengers combined apiece would be, I don't know, we'll have to factor in children, so let's just say 150 pounds. Let's just go with that. 150 pounds per person, on average. These cars can hold 30 or 40 people. We're talking at least 5,000 pounds, if not more, that was not on board the train at the time. Afterwards, the authorities were a little miffed as to how to remove the train safely, eventually settling on a crane, which does seem like the most logical way to go, and the whale sculpture was absolutely fine. The train suffered damage. I couldn't figure out exactly what happened to the unit, but looking at it, I would give an educated guess to say it was probably repaired, as it doesn't look total to me. And if it is a 5500 like I think it is, these are not that old. But again, I don't know that for sure, because none of the articles I found specifically say what happened to the unit after the crash. But what exactly caused the incident, you may be wondering? Why did the train overrun the platform and slam through the barrier? Well, it's actually one of the most simple explanations I've ever had to go into. Based off of the investigation, it was completely the driver's fault. When he entered the platform, he was doing 57 kilometers an hour. The speed limit for that area is 35 kilometers per hour. He simply couldn't stop the train in time. And he's rather fortunate that not only did he survive, but that there was no one on board that could have been hurt by his mistake. As for what happened to him, well, based on what I figured out, he was reminded of the rules he failed to follow and was fired, which makes sense to me. That seems like a completely reasonable course of action in this situation. I mean, that was totally his fault. The only argument anyone might have is that had the lines had positive train control, the Metro would have been automatically slowed down and the incident would have never happened. But also, the driver has to know that there isn't positive train control, and therefore he should be responsible enough to not go blaring into the station way too fast and then wind up sitting atop a whale statue, of all places. This made international news. It was so ridiculous. And that's why, even though it's fairly recent, I absolutely had to discuss it, because I feel like this is probably the only time anything like this has ever occurred, or will occur. These stories keep getting weirder. I don't know what's going on with this channel. Like, I just keep digging into this rabbit hole of weird stuff involving trains, and it's just eternal. It just keeps going, and yeah. As it turns out, trains run into, well, animals pretty often. And it's unfortunate, but it is just kind of a fact of life. In fact, there was an incident in 2017 where over 100 reindeer were killed by a train in Norway. Now, that's kind of a high bar. It doesn't usually get that bad. As other countries in the north will probably tell you, large animals just chilling on the railway lines up there is not something that's unusual, whether it be in Alaska or Canada, and Norway by extension. And even down here in countries that are closer to the equator, I mean, how often do deer get hit by cars or other animals? In fact, if you drive, I'm sure you've dodged a handful of animals in your time. Once I even struck a deer, which I felt really bad about as it was just a baby, but it was something that just occurred, came out of nowhere. It happens. I'm not a hunter myself, and I don't like killing things, but as long as we're using these vehicles, we have to remember that other animals share the planet with us, and that sometimes those animals will wind up in the way. You'd think animals would learn to avoid train tracks as they're pretty obvious, but sometimes it just doesn't happen, particularly in more rural areas where the trains are a little less frequent. But we're not talking about just any animal in this case, because the specific incident derailed the train. And how often does an animal derail the train? Land-based animals usually aren't large enough to cause that kind of issue for a locomotive. I say usually because there are exceptions, of course, and one of the exceptions happens to be the Great Northern Moose. Now, it's important for me to stress at this time that we call it a moose here in North America, but over in Norway, they would actually refer to this animal as an elk, which is super confusing because back over here in North America, we call an entire different member of the deer family, also rather large, an elk. But for the sake of clarity, this is what I'm talking about when I say moose. Big, giant moose. Moose are in fact the largest and heaviest extant species in the deer family. They have huge antlers, massive bodies, and male members of the species can weigh over 1,500 pounds. Moose are also kind of dangerous. Unlike our friendly white-tailed deer here in America that generally won't attack you unless it's mating season and it's a buck in a grumpy mood, moose are pretty territorial. And they're big, so they can do a lot of damage if they decide they don't like you. So I'm going to stress at this time that if you ever run into a moose, just don't bother it. Just leave it alone. Alright? Moose don't like to be bothered. They don't like to be bothered. They're pretty chill normally, but they will mess you up. And cars have struck moose before, and in many cases the moose literally walks away. The car doesn't. But a train is different. A train is still going to be a lot heavier than a moose. But even at that, a moose is still big on its own, and it could cause damage to the train. The locomotive involved was hard for me to figure out as none of the sources specifically say what it was. However, based on the fact that this was a freight train, and the timing involved, I'm going to go out on a limb and say it was probably an EMD Class 66, which was originally developed for use as British Rail, under the same category. However, many countries in mainland Europe actually took EMD up on the offering of the Class 66, and one of them was Norway. Unlike the British Rail Class 59, which as we talked about before, was actually built from an SD40-2, Class 66 was built more from the ground up. They're pretty good diesels all around, that's why they've had so many customers. But on that day, one finally ran into a worthy opponent. A moose. The moose in question did not have a name, did not have a title. We don't even know what kind of history it would have had. After all, it was a mysterious moose that came out of nowhere. Actually, it probably didn't even come out of nowhere. More likely, it just stood in the track and moose don't care about you, or your Honda Civic it just destroyed, or the Class 66 carrying a load of iron ore heading straight towards him. It was August 18th, 2006, a Monday, and it happened on the line between Trondheim and Bodo. That's a very northern part of the line. It actually crosses the Arctic Circle up there. Under normal situations, a locomotive would blow its horn and attempt to get the animal off. In this instance, the moose did not move. Animals sometimes will do this, and unlike with cars where we could slam on our brakes and hope for the best, train drivers really can't do anything. I mean, they could brake, but there's no way they'd be able to stop in time, so they just blow their horn and hope they get off. The moose didn't. Normally an animal would be small enough that a train would simply run over it and keep going. It's unfortunate, but it happens. But a moose is a little bit different because a moose is very, very big, very heavy, very sturdy, and it was enough of a hindrance on the line that it did cause the locomotive to derail. None of the sources I have mention any injuries, so it's likely the crew was fine. But the derailment was bad enough, and in a remote enough region, that the cleanup took some time. This part of the line was also frequented by their passenger trains, and service didn't return to normal until that Friday, because of a moose. It's not something you would expect to cripple a rail network, and to be honest, I'm not sure there was any way to avoid this problem. Even if you put fences around the lines, which would take a lot of time and money, moose don't care about that either. They would literally just go over the fences. Moose kind of stand as a last remnant of Ice Age megafauna. They're not as big as those animals were, but they're pretty close. And I guess the lesson here is, look, if ever you're thinking about messing with a moose, you think it might be funny, maybe it'll get you some nice views on TikTok if you get super close to that moose. Yeah, okay, you know what's gonna get you a lot of views on TikTok? Getting mauled and stomped on and destroyed by the moose you decided to harass. Leave them alone. They do not want to be bothered. Please, they're scary.